everyone. I'm Michaela Parker, founder and executive director for the Academic Data Science Alliance, and I'm here to welcome you to our virtual discussion. Our panelists are listed down here. You'll hear from all of them today, but first I wanted to introduce those of you who are not yet familiar with the Academic Data Science Alliance to our community. So, also known as ADSA, we are a community of data science researchers and educators who take responsibility for a just, equitable future where data science approaches are thoughtfully applied in all domains for the benefit of all. On this slide and the subsequent slides is a QR code. You can snap that. It will take you to our website where you can learn more about our events, activities, mission, vision, values, and how to become a member. And so with that, I thank you all for joining us, and I'll now introduce our moderator. Keolu Fox is the first native Hawaiian to receive a doctorate in genome sciences, and he's an assistant professor at the University of California, San Diego, where he's a co-founder and co-director of the world's first Indigenous Futures Institute. Keolu's work focuses on the connection between raw data as a resource and the emerging value of genomic health data from Indigenous communities. He has experience designing and engineering genome sequencing and editing technologies, and a decade of grassroots experience working with Indigenous partners to advance precision medicine. So with that, Keolu, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you. Mahalo, everybody. I'm joining you from Oahu. And aloha, thank you so much for the opportunity. Lovely to have these incredible speakers with us today talking about community-based benefit sharing and many of the applications of this. But first, I thought I would give you a little bit of a brief historical background on some of this, and then I'm going to introduce each of our incredible speakers. So without further ado, a brief historical tune-up on why data sovereignty is important. Many of you have probably heard of this at this point in time. It's less of a moment and now more of a movement. It has been catalyzed in all of these different directions and trajectories with relation to everything from health data to GIS data, photogrammetry data for cultural heritage. Today, though, the majority of our guests will be talking about health and genomic data as it relates to human beings, but many of these applications and ideas are directly related to any form of genome sequence data, whether it's microbiome or soil or otherwise. Principally, though, defining what data is actually a lot more difficult than one would think. I chose this definition and I paired it with this picture of all of these zeros and ones. That's logically how we refer to these things known or assumed as facts, making the basis of reasoning or calculation. And then sovereignty, also extremely difficult to define if one principally tries to do that. I really didn't like the definition that came up most often, which was supreme power or authority. I kind of take more of an indigenous position on this and thinking about a self-governing state. And I thought this picture was really illustrative of what's going on here. We have these sort of imagined political boundaries that aren't based on geography, and we've divvied up resources that we sort of allocate and extract from a lot of these places and positions. And you can't, entangle, or you can try to entangle data from sovereignty, from nationalism, and there are a lot of really important details, principles, policies, and technologies that go into that. Speaking of the technologies, there are some things that you must have to set this up, and it sort of is directly related to the technology in the sense that it's expensive, and this creates hierarchy and power imbalances and reinforces a lot of these power imbalances. In 2018, we were informed, and I think the whole world really understands that the world's most valuable resource is data itself, surpassing oil in 2018. And I love this cartoon from The Economist where you see all of these major companies. I forget what they've called the acronym now, but you know who I'm talking about: Google, Facebook, Tesla, Amazon. And their principal resource is data itself. And that's why they're the largest companies in the world. They have vertical integration of many of these things. So thinking about data as a resource and how to protect it is really important, and thinking about how to share those resources or intellectual property and royalties that are derived from this in an equitable way is sort of the core of our conversation today around benefit sharing. And so with that, I will introduce today's speakers. So our first speaker, first of all, I would just like to say that all of our speakers today are what we in Hawaii call manawahine. These are women of power. So first we have Krystal Tsosie. Krystal is Dene. She's from Navajo Nation, and she's an indigenous geneticist and bioethicist at Vanderbilt University. She's an incoming assistant professor faculty at Arizona State University, and she's an advocate for indigenous genomic and data sovereignty. She co-founded the first U.S. indigenous-led biobank, a 5013C nonprofit research institution, the first of its kind, called the Native BioData Consortium, and much of her current research centers on ethical engagement with indigenous communities in precision health and precision medicine. She also incorporates biostatistics, genetic epidemiology, public health, and computational approaches to health and health disparities. And if you don't follow her on Twitter, she's amazing, informative, hilarious, all of that. Our next speaker is Dr. Latifa Jackson, and Latifa received her PhD in biomedical science at Drexel University in Philadelphia, with a focus on bioinformatics and a master's degree in ecology and evolutionary biology from the University of Arizona. She uses informatics and machine learning approaches to study genetic patterns that contribute to disease and the environmental factors that modulate their biological function. Additionally, she examines African-American ancestry using human genomic data. These projects have been recognized with the introduction as a full member into Sigma Chi, the Scientific Honor Society in 2017, a feature in the American Sciences in 2019, and her postdoctoral funding through a competitive NIH TL1 fellowship awarded by the Georgetown Howard University Center for Clinical and Translational Medicine. Latifa is a strong advocate for broadening participation of underrepresented minority groups in bioinformatics and science, and she does so much more. And again, super informative and hilarious. Please give her a follow on Twitter. Anne McCartney graduated top of her class in genetics and cell biology and was granted an Irish Research Council Award, that's a mouthful, to complete her PhD in bioinformatics and molecular evolution in Dublin City University in Ireland. I've been there, beautiful place. Her first postdoctoral research fellowship for genomics at Aotearoa focused on developing genomics pipelines that integrate Mataranga Maori in Aotearoa, New Zealand. From there, she transitioned to Genome Informatics section in the National Human Genome Research Institute, where she works with Maori, Native American, and Sami partners to build indigenous data provenance capacity for the European Reference Genome Atlas in partnership with RDA, Local Complexities, and the amazing GIDA organization. Anne's research centers around developing equitable and respectful genomic research sharing and management infrastructures. As always, give her a follow on Twitter and take a look at her social media. Our next speaker is the CEO, and well, now she's a co-founder, but she is Dr. Kaja Wasik. She's the co-founder and chief science officer at Variant Bio, so CSO, a Seattle-based startup developing therapies to improve global health by studying the genes of individuals and populations who are outliers for medically relevant traits. Kaja started Variant Bio because she believes that human genetics has the power to transform drug development, and it does. Variant Bio was built on a strong ethical foundation to ensure that study participants benefit from their involvement. Kaja received her MA in political science and MS in biology at the University of Warszawa and completed her PhD in molecular biology at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. She's also hilarious and super informative on Twitter, and you should give her a follow. And all of these speakers are going to be presenting today. So, wow, you guys have such impressive CVs. So I guess our first speaker is Krystal, no?
It is my honor to present very briefly on our genomes, our data for our benefit. So let's start with a common trope that we see a lot in articles espoused by many population geneticists, especially in regards to Indigenous peoples, that in order to ameliorate health disparities in Indigenous communities, and if you're Alaskan and Native or American Indian, unfortunately, we fare worse across many chronic health disease outcomes compared to the dominant population, then it follows that we also need to include more Indigenous participants in genomic studies, especially since over a decade of efforts, despite over a decade of efforts, we still have like less than 1% of participants of Indigenous heritage being included or engaged in Indigenous studies. And very cheekily state that this is an overly simplistic narrative, and that it is accurate because there are many sustained and ongoing reasons why Indigenous peoples may choose not to engage in genomic research. And these reasons are incredibly interlinked and complex, stemming from cultural and political reasons. But really central to all of this is a history of distrust that still persists even despite some ethical guidelines today. And we also have to challenge this notion about genetics predisposing or contributing heavily toward health disparities without also acknowledging the role of structural barriers related to health. Let us consider that in 2018, before the pandemic, the Indian Health Services spent an average about $3,800 per patient, compared to the national spending per capita for that same year, which was 2.4 times greater. So the message that's often told to Indigenous peoples is that they will miss out on precision health benefits if they do not engage. But there are reasons why Indigenous people have chosen not to engage in genomics research, largely due to research harms. But if we are not changing the system to change the power imbalances that created these research harms to begin with, then what we're effectively doing is engaging in a cycle of victim blaming and coercion that Indigenous peoples feel and experience when they're given this message of coercion in order to participate in genetic studies. I also want to highlight the value of Indigenous DNA and also provide some reasons why open access data is not the solution to everything, as often told in this current big data era of harmonization. So let us start with a brief overview of open access data in regards to Indigenous peoples. In 1993, scientists began and announced the Human Genome Diversity Project, which was one of many earlier large-scale diversity projects. And the goal was to map human genetic variation of populations worldwide. Underlying some of the language was a rush for sampling Indigenous peoples, in particularly before they, quote, vanished. So not really caring about why Indigenous peoples were being exploited and also were their rights usurped or anything. It was more about the collection of Indigenous genomic information before they become in a rush for scientific utility and the greater good of science. Again, not benefiting Indigenous peoples. And to no surprise, Indigenous peoples worldwide lambasted and opposed HGDPs. Message really heavily at this point in time in the 90s, already citing concerns related to gene patenting and biocommercialization of Indigenous biomarkers. In 2005, we have the landmark study by HGDP in which they showed their, quote, successful recruitment of global populations, including 5 Indigenous groups. Now, look at the geography of these groups. They're largely not in the US because US Indigenous peoples by and large have federal recognized sovereignty. Rather, they're in the global South. in areas where Indigenous peoples have been disenfranchised and disempowered, and in many cases not even recognized by their colonial governments. Yet, this is where a bulk of the data that has come from these openly available databases have been usurped and collected from. And again, no surprise, 2 years later, that we have a United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples related to these large-scale diversity projects. In particular, over 600 Indigenous nations worldwide signed a petition recommending the cessation of large-scale diversity projects, again citing concerns related to co-optation and ownership of biological information that maybe perhaps shouldn't be owned by a single entity. Shortly thereafter, we have the launching of two major behemoths in the genetic ancestry world and the direct-to-consumer testing world. 23andMe and Ancestry started some of their technological empires utilizing these openly available data from diversity projects such as HDDP, such that if you want to pay about $100 to estimate your supposed Native American ancestry, you can look to these tools to be able to do that, again, utilizing exploited biomarkers from disenfranchised Indigenous peoples. So this is a quote that I think really highlights exactly what Keolu mentioned when he did his introduction, that raw data stemming from digital sequence information derived from human genomic information has emerged as a top global commodity. And if we look at this too, what we have seen in the last few years is a huge amassing of genetic data from direct-to-consumer testing companies, such that on average, one individual contributes to over 200 different research studies. To think about the commercial lucrative nature of this data, let's think about Ancestry DNA, which until very recently was posting profits over $1 billion every holiday quarter since 2017, until they were sold by a venture capitalist firm by the name of Blackstone for $4.7 billion in 2020. So what we see is an interesting pivot. We see first a pivot of genetic ancestry testing as entertainment, and in really highlighting the interest in collection of Native American DNA. Ancestry on their own blog posted that their number one question that they received about their genetic ancestry test was, why isn't my Native American ancestry not showing up? Thereby showing an interest about people utilizing this test, particularly for weird biologization and false connections and connectivity and conflations of related DNA to indigeneity. But what we have actually seen is, due to the huge accumulation of data and DNA that's commercially lucrative, we now see the announcement of 23andMe pivoting to the realm of clinical testing and drug development. So what they have done is they're going to, they have been able to leverage this huge database that they have created specifically for working and for drug development, which is very commercially lucrative. So we have to ask ourselves, what are Indigenous peoples getting out of this deal? In 2007, a New York Times reporter went to the Krystal, which is an Amazonian tribe, and this reporter asked the community, what was it that researchers promised you in exchange for your blood? And they said, we were promised medicines and therapeutics that were going to treat our people and save our people's lives. And what the reporter announced is that, in fact, the access to the genomic information was being sold to colonial cell repositories at $75 to $85 a vial. And in the meantime, however, the medicines that they were promised were never delivered. So this runs to the question of data for whose benefit. We have often heard promises as Indigenous peoples that someday, somewhere down the line, the collectivization of our DNA is going to lead to some benefit to our peoples through therapeutics that are going to be delivered. But the pathway is never actually clear. And in fact, when they talk to scientists, they some of them have unfortunately disappointingly stated that their domain is not in the delivery of therapeutics, their domain is purely in the research. So what we have is an example of promises are made to Indigenous peoples for the collection of their data, but the first people to benefit are not the community members themselves, but rather other entities. So this actually leads me to a very important point, and one that I'm really proud to address, which is a new model of Indigenous-centered approaches to DNA and data ownership. So this, if you're not already familiar with the concept of Indigenous genomic data sovereignty, it is the right of Indigenous nations and peoples to exercise authority and autonomy to protect their interests related to their own genomic data. So we have announced a couple of years ago the beginning of a research collaboration and project with tribal nations of the US called the Native BioData Consortium, in which board members are comprised of Indigenous geneticists and also tribal community members. The reason why we started this was because when we were asking tribal leaders why they were not interested in participating in federally funded research, they stated to us that they were concerned about the deposition of their people's data in repositories that were not governed by the tribal members, or in repositories in which their own people didn't really have a say who had access to it and what type of research can be undertaken with their people's DNA. So what we decided is that, you know, in order to break this cycle, we had to provide an alternative. We could provide and create a repository that is tribally governed, and therefore not only ensures the security of the data, but also ensures that only trusted individuals and researchers that have pre-approved tribal research protocols are actually able to access the data themselves. And really what's important though is that we're keeping the data local to the communities to ensure that the research projects not only are of interest to Indigenous community members, but also actually benefit them. So this is a really important concept because too often we see sort of a leaky pipeline in which data is generated from Indigenous peoples and exported outside of the communities to benefit other entities besides the tribes themselves. And what we're advocating is for a different model in which the data that's collected from Indigenous peoples is overseen by Indigenous peoples, analyzed by Indigenous peoples, and importantly, any intellectual property that is generated during this process is retained by Indigenous peoples. And what that enables us to be able to do is really talk about creating data economies that really talk about bridging these technological innovations and making sure that they are regenerative back into the community in an equitable fashion. So if we're going to talk about ethics and equity and justice, it's not enough to just bandy about propaganda about increased inclusion of Indigenous peoples in data sets, because that's the same rhetoric that has been given to Indigenous peoples in the past. We really cannot equate inclusion with equity. If we want to think about justice-centered approaches, we have to also consider that in terms of genetic innovations, the lowest hanging fruit has already been picked. We already have a knowledge of Mendelian variants contributing to disease, common variants related to common disease. The next innovations to advance genomic technologies will be in small untested populations like our own. And these, especially in the case of Indigenous peoples, are the same populations that have been historically oppressed. So if we really want to talk about empowering Indigenous-led research and also breaking the cycle of distrust and encouraging equitable participation, then we also need to empower data decisions coming from tribes. Akeha, thank you so much. Here's some more resources, and thank you so much for your time.
Awesome, amazing. In the interest of time and just getting us to our panel, I'm not going to ask you any questions because I talk to you every day. And next up, we will have Dr. Latifa Jackson.
I really am appreciative that I'm going after Krystal because many of the things that she talked about are implicit in the kind of work that I wanted to show you. Let's see if I can, here we go. So I wanted to kind of focus on three ideas. The one is, and these are really around how data science can be used in service of community. And I know we think a lot about how we monetize data science and how we exploit data science, but these are three ways, I think. One, the first one following on exactly some of Krystal's points, and then the other two diverging a little bit. So the first idea is really, how do we identify health needs? And my work started as so many of you guys' work probably did, with simple observations. And for us, and especially as an assistant professor at a historically Black college or university at Howard, we're always thinking, what is the state of our people? And what is underlying the state of our people? So one of the questions we asked was, why do African Americans experience shorter life expectancies than their European American counterparts? And this is even when we correct for education level, economic status, etc. And those are 3 years between Black women and white women, and 4.5 years between Black men and white men. And so what we did was really try to understand some of the well-studied contributors to disparities. Let's do something real quick. In health life expectancy. So socioeconomics, I feel like we all have a really good sense of that from, if you guys, or if you didn't, George Floyd has now made that really abundantly clear, the advocacy work that communities have done to say that there are long-term disparities that exist for historical, structural, systemic reasons. Healthcare access, biomedical study participation, which is in line with what Krystal was mentioning, for people who in particular have some expectation of benefit for their community, but in fact don't find themselves being the beneficiaries of data. But I also wanted to study the communities in which people live, because there's a lot of people thinking about those first three kind of categories. I wanted to think a little bit more about the role of violence exposure. And to be clear here, I'm talking about violence victimization, not violence perpetration, and discrimination on immune health. And so one of the things I started to look at was that we now know that violence exposure invokes a stress response. And studies have shown that there's accumulating evidence for the link between stress and inflammation through this hypothalamus pituitary adrenal cascade, leading to secretion of stress hormones, cortisol being a prime candidate. But there's also been a host of studies that have shown this kind of information, and I just kind of threw a couple up here so that you guys could see and follow up if you were so interested. But for us, because we're Howard University, we really wanted to try to look at a very unique study population. And this study population are everything that you know about Washington, D.C. if you're not from the city, throw that out of your mind. This is not Scandal. This is not West Wing. Those things all happen in Ward 2. These are the two wards, Ward 7 and 8, that are east of the Anacostia. There is currently no hospitals in those two wards. They are the most economically alienated and resource deprived wards in the entire city. So while DC is a relatively wealthy city, these two wards are not. And what we tried to do is ask about the lives of African Americans in these wards, because while DC is a metropolitan city, these two wards are overwhelmingly African American. And we were able to collect not only, and this is once again where the intersection between data from a trusted seeker of knowledge intersects with a community willing to try to take a risk to better understand their own health, kind of intersect. But we were able to collect 600 different pieces of information about their exposure to violence, their coping strategies, and then also really try to understand information about their immune stress. And when we did that, we found that 2 biomarkers, immunoglobulin E and Epstein-Barr virus, are intimately associated with violence exposure and mental health state. So the more exposure to violent conditions that they experience, the more mental health challenges that they experience, and the elevated levels of Epstein-Barr virus and IgE. And if Epstein-Barr virus sounds familiar, you probably saw just last week, I think it was, that Epstein-Barr virus is implicated as a mitigating factor in multiple sclerosis. So there's a lot to unpack in populations that are having chronic inflammation. So the next thing we tried to do is really understand what that really meant for these populations in terms of violence exposure, because that was in the entire population set. But what we saw is that there is clearly a group that experiences really high violence exposure, and then most of the population who, even though they live on this exact same block, experience very different exposures to law enforcement, to communities. And so it's always a cautious reminder to ourselves that as we look at communities, as we partner with communities, as we think about data, that no community is uniform, and that instead we have to try to use the appropriately sophisticated data science techniques in order to really understand the patterning that we're seeing in populations, so that we can in fact avoid talking about communities as monolithic. But one of the things that really came out of this research, and this is kind of the wrap up of this little kind of section, was that we find that both situational violence and exposure to violence, whether that's physical, threat, witnessed, intimate partner violence, or a cumulative sum of those things, actually is correlated with shorter telomere length through depression, right? So these exposures to violence, and this is violence victimization, lead to depression, and that depression is tightly correlated with shorter telomere length. And shorter telomere length is associated with shorter lifespans, increased aging, etc. So here's one way in which we can use data to really understand the health of communities. And the thing that has been really helpful for us is in making sure that that the community is with us as we walk through this process. So we write a paper, we have a town hall meeting. We think about, a presentation for a community, we ask our community advisory board, seeking that consistent conversation back and forth between the community and the research that we're doing. The second area is something that African Americans in particular are deeply desirous of, and that is understanding their communal connections. And whereas many Native American communities in this country have a very strong sense of ties to ancestry, even though their ties to potential original homeland have been disrupted, for African Americans, because of the transatlantic slave trade, there really has been a cut between who they are as individuals and in nuclear families, and who they are as communities, and what their ancestry ties to. And so here we looked at a totally different set of individuals. Now, these are individuals who are collected mostly at Howard University, some in South Carolina, Oklahoma, and St. Helena, which is an island that you probably know from Napoleon's second and lasting exile. But we collected both sort of genomic information about these individuals, and then we also collected genealogical histories from these individuals going back to their fourth great grandparents on both sides. And then we were able to really use this information. These are the two fantastic undergrads who are working on this project. So I dare not avoid saying that they did a lot of work on this project. What we did was try to use genealogical responses to reconstruct the phylogenies of their local ancestry. And then to try to take that information, both looking at sort of where we know slaveholding states or enslaved Africans were brought, and then looking all throughout the East Coast in the Mid-Atlantic region up through Maine. And what we actually find is that we see strong evidence just when we ask about ancestral place of birth for the Great Migration, right? And so part of use of data is about genomics. And yes, we can construct those lineages using genomics, and that's really important. But also as part about using genealogies to really understand what these lineages look like and how we can use that information in ways that help us understand human population movements. And then the third area was really trying to build these skill sets, because one of the things about data is that they are both a hindrance to equality, and they also are an equalizer for equality, depending on how they're being used. And so in particular, I've worked for the past 7 or 8 years with broadening participation in data mining or data science to really try to build a cohort of very diverse, whether that is along gender lines, along ability lines, along race and ethnicity lines, in order for us to have the people who are analyzing the data be as diverse as the data sources themselves. And so obviously the first step of doing that is asking for and requiring diverse data analyzers. And so this is the cohort that we had in 2019, which was the last time that I think all of us were able to freely meet in person without any thought to COVID. And we do it in partnership with both commercial groups, but then also with national labs, with the federal government, with academic institutions. And the idea really is to raise the profile of a particular cohort of students. And that's really important because these particular students, were really interested in working for these companies. And so we try to, find the match between these two things. And then part of that work is really trying to understand how do we build the hands-on expertise. And so I know that boot camps are really popular now. Those are not the kind of things that we're thinking about. We're more thinking about how do we get, oh my God, I'm like totally in the dark. How do we get trainees to work towards analyzing data, asking the questions that can really only come from having an understanding of American society and having an understanding of their local communities and bringing both of those things to the table, right? And it really has been an important aspect of looking at, for example, AI fairness in criminal justice systems in the US. So we wrote a paper on including vulnerable populations in the analysis of vulnerable data. And then so for this case, the vulnerable population was people who were incarcerated or who are going to be incarcerated. And so really trying to work with that community to try to understand how pre-trial detention was actually being meted out from an algorithmic perspective. And so we did that for the past two broadening participation in data mining workshop events. And then now we're actually working on the effects of gentrification in the nation's capital. And even though I showed you that Ward 7 and 8 are the most sort of African-American rich, Washington, D.C. is undergoing extreme gentrification, and we're less interested in what happens to the buildings, but what does that mean for the community surrounding it? The state of Maryland, the state of Virginia, how do their criminal justice systems, how do their education systems, how do their health systems adjust to the massive displacement of individuals as property values rise and people are forced out of community, right? So those are the kinds of things that, quite honestly, they're not being addressed because the people who are sitting at the table right now may not have that perspective that that's a good thing to address. And so I'm always trying to make sure that as we think about data and we think about how data can help communities, that we're centering the communities in those. And so one of the things that we've been planning to do is, once again, to include community members in this process so that their perspectives and the return of results are a seamless cycle. So I think that that may be the very last slide. I tried not to overburden you guys with the slides. Yep, but I will pass it back, and thank you so much for listening.
We're going to move on to our next speaker, and that will be, I believe, Dr. McCartney. And she's going to talk about her work on and utilizing, operationalizing biocultural labels with Uncle Maui Hudson. Take it away.
Thank you, Keolu. Juda Chikara, Ishmisha Onion Kartna. So hello, everybody. My name is Anne McCartney, and I am absolutely delighted to be a part of this panel today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my work with, in partnership with Maui Hudson and Jane Anderson through the Local Context Hub, and our partnership with the European Reference Genome Atlas. And really, this whole conversation is talking, speaks towards how we are going about decolonizing digital sequence information as part of this project. So the mission of the European Reference Genome Atlas specifically is to generate reference quality genome assemblies for all European eukaryotic species. And so the reference genome establishment pipeline really goes from right from sampling and taxonomy right through to the data handling, genome analyses downstream. And so we are a relatively new consortium, but we have over 600 scientists across 50 countries across Europe. And so what our main aim is to—
And sorry, I'm really sorry, but you need to put a presenter mode because we can't see your slides changing. So we're on the title slide, or at least is it just me?
Thank you for pointing that out. Okay, sorry, thank you. So one of our main goals for this project is to have an informatics and bioinformatics pipeline in place that can dynamically increase over time. And so each species that is part of the European Reference Genome Atlas that we will produce a reference genome for has a genome team behind this. And we really promote that the sample provider is from the country of origin, and that each individual as part of this genome team is actually part of a different country, so that we have this transporter collaboration of how the genomes are being assembled and analyzed. And so we wanted to ensure that our informatics and bioinformatics pipelines were equitable and inclusive to all countries and all peoples and all regions in Europe, because biodiversity is equally distributed across Europe. But if you break down to the gross national income and investment in research and development expenditure, it's not so equitable. So we wanted to give everybody an equal opportunity to participate in the project. Part of this was having a good organizational structure in place. So we have several committees right through from our sample collection and processing through to ethics, legal and social issues. And I'm the chair of the Ethics, Legal and Social Issues Committee, and we really find ourselves embedding in all of the other committees to try and streamline ethical and legal compliance for all of our reference genomes that we are producing. So Europe is also home to two recognized indigenous peoples. They are the Greenlandic Inuit and the Sami across the Sampi region, which spans Finland, Norway, and Sweden. And like many other indigenous peoples, research has radically failed Sami in the past. And I'm just giving two articles here, one of skulls that have been repatriated from Sami just in 2019 from museums, and they repatriated them. It took them over, decades and decades. And another article that really highlights that non-Sami individuals conducting research on Sami culture is actually can be destructive. And they found that the research really doesn't give anything back to the Sami people. And so these were the precedents that we wanted to avoid building IRGA. And so part of the way we went about this was partnering up with the local context hub to decolonize our biodiversity genomics data through inclusive metadata collection. So each genome that we were producing, we wanted to ensure that we were being as inclusive and comprehensive as possible with our metadata, because it's well known that only, I think, 14% of genomics data in the INSDC, which is a public repository, has both the country of origin and the nation state in the metadata. So if we are to think about expanding benefit sharing mechanisms, it's really important that we have the provenance data in the metadata associated if it is in a public archive for this. And this is under debate by the Conference of Parties for the CBD, the Convention of Biological Diversity. And this is a really hot debate on how benefits should be shared either bilaterally or multilaterally between the parties there. And so the way we operationalized this in IRGA was we both want all of our genomics data to abide by the fair data sharing principles of being findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, but also to align with the CARE data sharing principles of collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. And so Local Context Hub is a wonderful nonprofit organization led by Maui Hudson and Jane Anderson, and they have produced a fleet of traditional knowledge and biocultural labels and notices. And why we wanted to use these was to recognize the inherent sovereignty of Indigenous communities, of their data and their knowledge that has come from their lands, territories, and waters, but also to manage the intellectual and cultural property of Indigenous heritage, environmental data, genetics resources within open, within any digital environment, whether it be open or not. So some key issues for Indigenous peoples when we speak about genomics data and genomics data sharing is how do we recognize Indigenous rights and interests in raw data and digital sequence information, which is genomics sequence information, in open data environments? How do we share and collaborate, utilizing ethical access and use practices when there's all that are consistent with existing community protocols? And then finally, how do we negotiate our equitable sharing of benefits if indeed there was some form of commercialization? And so the labels themselves that we have, firstly, a set of traditional knowledge labels. These are 20 digital tags that can be attached to any Indigenous knowledge. In this case, they're using for genomic sequence information, but it's actually used in many museums for artifacts, for the songs, for dance. So any type of cultural or Indigenous knowledge. And these digital tags give attribution rights, access rights, and the rights for use and reuse of the genomics information. The second set of labels are the biocultural labels. These are 10 digital tags that define community expectations. They connect the data to the peoples and environments they came from. They give accurate provenance and they provide transparency and integrity. So what they communicate more generally is provenance. So they identify who's the primary cultural authority for that data. They also define the protocols. So are there traditional protocols associated with the access and use of that data? Finally, they give permission. So they indicate what activities the communities has approved for use as generally acceptable and what conditions and research they would like to be directly engaged with. So the way this works in a digital environment is that these tags are both human and machine readable. So the way the process starts is before sample collection, both the Indigenous community and the researchers sign up to the local context hub. From there, after sample collection, the researcher or the institution would issue a biocultural or traditional knowledge notice, which it sits on the local context hub. The Indigenous community then is alerted and it goes into the local context hub on their end and either verifies or rejects that their notice is valid. And then they can stipulate what type of access, permissions, protocols, and provenance they would like to place in that digital sequence information. And so that label then it carries back to the researcher, and that's what travels with the data through the metadata and onto publications, for example. So the way that we implemented this in URGA is we first placed all of the necessary documentation on how to register and properly sample on Indigenous lands into our standards of practice. So this points all of our researchers towards the local context hub, who then, if they're collecting on Indigenous lands, can apply a notice to the to the sample at metadata collection stage. We then had to create our metadata manifest, and this is the fields that absolutely every single data that's associated with your genomics data goes into your metadata. But there was no fields in traditional metadata manifests to acknowledge the rights of Indigenous peoples in the biodiversity space. So URGA was the first consortium to introduce 5 fields so that these labels and tags could be placed in with the metadata. And so first place really giving these labels voice in the digital space. We are now mapping these to Darwin Core to the rights holder field, and we were working with Darwin Core to create new fields so that we can be interoperable with other projects and promote this amongst other projects globally, so that they're actually introducing these fields as well into globally in the biodiversity space. This is just showing you that how we select whatever label we'd like to associate. And so after the researcher discloses a notice, it goes to our metadata brokering service, and this is called COPO. And what COPO does, it validates that all of your metadata is appropriate. So you've entered the right name, the sample collector ID, etc. And so if there's no label or notice, right now our data goes into the European Nucleotide Archive. But if a notice is in the metadata manifest, COPO recognizes this and it interacts with the local context hub API. It checks daily on this API to see whether the Indigenous community has placed a label on that metadata, and it sits in the data sits where it is until this label is noticed. So it doesn't move until we get a label. After the label has been issued by the Indigenous community, we then send that data to the appropriate place as determined by the Indigenous peoples. So whether it be in a local repository or whether it be a national repository or wherever they would like their data to be shared. And so we hope to expand this also, that these labels and tags can actually be associated with all of the vouchers and the biobank specimens as well, for any samples associated collected on Indigenous lands. So we have a pilot project, and so all of our pilot project, we have 95 species being sequenced, and all of these sample providers have the opportunity to place a digital, one of the traditional knowledge or biocultural tags onto these species. And this is what our project looks like so far. It's a work in progress for sure. We've got 28 species in assembly at the moment. We've got 18 in active sequencing, and we've 20 ready to sequence in the sequencing center. And this is just showing that it really is a pan-European effort with a lot of countries involved. So these are the people behind the pilot project, and I'm highlighting our YouTube video here that you'll really get to see the diversity of members that are involved in the pilot project through their language. So they speak on how Urga has brought biodiversity genomics to their country in their native tongue, and it's really wonderful to listen to. And I also would like to thank the people behind the labels and implementation. So the local context partners, Maui and Jane. I also have a bunch of Sami partners like Annaleel Druga, Per Axelson, and Susanna. I partnered with COPO, Rob Davey, leading that team, the Research Data Alliance, thanks to Stephanie, my Urga collaborators, and my other Kiwi collaborators, Libby Liggins and Eric Crandall from Genome. We also just got funded for a Horizon grant to further strengthen this partnership in the coming years. So I'll stop there and hand it back to Keolu.
All right, lastly is Dr. Kaja Wasik. Take it away.
Yep. Okay. So hi everybody. I'm reporting to you from the dark side, from the industry. I made a crossover a couple years ago where I started two companies in genomic space. My name is Kaja Wasik, and I'm currently the CSO and one of the co-founders of Variant Bio, which is a 3-year-old startup in the space of genomics. And I'd like to tell you a little bit more about what's kind of behind our research and about our approach, because obviously it's genetic data, and that's genetic projects including human participants, and our approach to community consultation, data governance, and benefit sharing. So I think based on what you've seen so far, and Krystal already alluded to this a lot, is there's a lot of genomic data out there, but it's not very representative to kind of the global population. So if you look, big pharma and academia are predominantly focused generating data from European individuals. If you think about those all well-funded large genetic biobanks like the UK Biobank that we're working on. So these represent only 16% of the world population, which is a tiny fraction of the global genetic diversity. And with such a narrow focus, there is a lot that's being missed, which significantly really limits our understanding of human disease, human health in both a global and a local setting. So as many of you probably know, Africa is the most genetically diverse continent on the planet, and it's pretty much neglected in genomic research. So what we're trying to do at Variant is we are focusing on working with in places that have traditionally been neglected by science. So we're focusing on the other 84% of the globe, which is of course not all at once. So our 4 pillars of how we kind of conduct our studies is to partner with different groups around the world, form partnerships around participant recruitment. We work with different communities, with academic partners, with hospital networks to recruit participants for genome sequencing, to share data related to their health and disease, medical records, diagnostic data, in order for us to identify, make genetic associations that can really inform drug discovery and diagnostics. So our goal in the end is to really develop novel treatments based on the findings that we generate from our data. And just in terms of kind of our scientific, where do we locate ourselves in the scientific world? We have a slightly different approach into how we try to generate those findings related to therapeutics, because we combine 2 factors in our project. So we look out for specific genetic architecture amongst the groups that we're working with. So that's architecture that is conducive to rare genetic variants rising to high frequency within that population. So there can be isolated populations that went through some type of a genetic bottleneck that have some kind of a founder effect, and we combined it with what we refer to as as outlier phenotype. And what that really means is maybe there's evidence of specific adaptation to an environment that we think could be medically relevant, or there's something different about a disease epidemiology without that population. So there might be much more of a specific disease, there might be much less, there might be something different about like disease progression, age of onset, and so on. And obviously looking for reasons to believe that there's a genetic contribution to this different disease epidemiology and not some environmental contribution. And we think this really setup can provide for better discoveries, because you can work in much smaller groups. So studies require much fewer individuals because you're kind of working in this very both genetically and environmentally homogeneous setup, and are much more likely to yield single genetic variants with strong effects. And single genetic variants with strong effects are the best candidates for drug discovery programs, because if you want to develop a therapeutic, you want to target a product of a single gene, and you want this effect to be robust. So really follow this path kind of from an outlier phenotype, an outlier trait to gene to therapy, because drugs with genetic support are over twice as likely to succeed in clinical trials. And considering the length and the cost that pharma companies put in clinical trials, that actually makes an enormous difference. And it's also been demonstrated, this approach has been demonstrated to work in the past in beautiful individual outlier studies with patients with extremely dense bones or patients with extremely low cholesterol levels, and 2 therapeutics for osteoporosis and for hypercholesterolemia were developed by Amgen and Regeneron. So obviously, in order to get there, in order to kind of arrive to those findings that we think are very important, we have to collect a lot of data, right? So we have to collect DNA, RNA, we're doing DNA, RNA sequencing, we're doing metabolomics, we're running numbers of different diagnostic tests, we're looking at the entire organ system in a way that is non-invasive or minimally invasive, like the blood draw, but ultimately we do collect a ton of data, and this data has to be governed properly. So as a company, we have thought about this for a number of years, and we do have certain principles around data governance. So obviously, we want to make sure that this large quantity of data that was shared with us, and it's a lot of trust is required to share so much data with a private company. We want to make sure that this data is secure and that it's treated with respect. So our commitment is around a number of different things. So one is consulting, so performing community consultation about every aspect of a project that we're designing, and then really incorporating the feedback of that consultation. So types of data collected, who's the custodian, sample and data destruction, and wishes around that, benefit sharing, and so on. We ensure that the data is governed by either the community or a trusted local research partner, and we're honestly temporarily accessing it. So it's kind of a data on loan model. We are never the entity that is the data custodian for any of our projects. We're committing to never selling the data or never actually sharing it. Only the data custodian potentially has the right to share the data if the community agrees to that, and then ultimately ensuring that participants benefit from the research through our benefit sharing program that I'm going to talk about a little bit more. So in terms of community consultation is very complicated, and I wanted to just show you an example of what we have done in French Polynesia and how we kind of think about approaching that. So obviously we think that it involves talking very broadly about a potential project, about a project that we're launching, to make sure that as many people as possible can be introduced to the fact that this project is happening in a local language. We talk lengthily to those who are executing the study nurses and different researchers who are going to interact with the participants, to make sure that they know how to talk to the participants about the project and about the findings and what to expect as findings and as results and as benefits, and the timelines of all of that. And then ultimately meeting with the community stakeholders, and that's really the most important part of these. So meeting with NGO leaders, religious leaders, politicians, government officials, like different types of cultural ambassadors, and just regular people to really incorporate this input into a project design to identify data and sample governing body and identify benefit sharing opportunities. A lot of that is reported in the form of a blog. A lot of the community engagement and kind of results of rolling out benefit sharing, we communicate this about very openly. So I really encourage everybody to go there and provide us with feedback. What do you think? Are we doing this right? What can we change, and really what we can improve? So our objective is really to, one of our objectives is to enable data governance directly by our partners, directly by the communities, ideally. So as we are getting deeper and deeper into this data governance process, it is very complicated for us because we're working globally, we're working in many different countries, which means different local legal regulations, different legal contexts, different ethical norms, depending on where you are. But also we see that the data governance, at least from what we're facing, is the most controversial really aspect of genetic research, and especially kind of the fact who has the power to decide about data usage. The participants that we are interacting with have less of a concern about how exactly this data is going to be utilized, because they know that if it's in the hands of somebody that they trust, this entity is going to make the best decisions about how this data is going to be used. So we're not at a point yet where we can absolutely enable community data custodianship, but we're trying to get there if possible. And there's a specific model that we're testing that it's in the process of testing. So I don't know how this will go yet, but this is something I'm hopefully will be able to talk about more in the future. So we host all of our data on AWS because it's one of the most secure global environments for data governance, and it really allows very efficient collaborations. You can build all your analytical pipelines there, and you can deploy it around the world. So when we work with our partners, we can determine where do they want this data to be physically stored, because I think what a lot of people sometimes don't realize is, even though we say the data is in the cloud, the server has a physical location somewhere. So the server is in Ohio. That means the privacy laws from the US apply to the data that's stored on this server. And we can, for instance, for our partnership in Australia, we can make sure that this data is stored in Australia and we can actually analyze it. So if desired, and this is exactly what we're testing and possible, we enable our partners to really manage their own cloud infrastructure. So we can set it up for them. We can set up their buckets where all those different types of data are being stored and copy the pipelines that we have in order to enable data analysis. And this is something that they completely own. This is something that they completely control. We can borrow the data from there for the purpose of however long the collaboration lasts to run the analysis that we have collectively agreed on, and then they can cut our access off, and they can take this this entire environment over and do whatever they want with it, and it can last in their hands under their control for an extended period of time. So we think this works really well so far, but what is complicated is, of course, it requires a substantial amount of training. Something that Keolu was talking about is not just, oh, great, now I have this data in my hand. There's a lot of security issues regarding human genetic data. So somebody who's really controlling this and is the decision maker has to be very properly trained to make sure that this data remains secure. So that really requires local capacity. And just because I talked about it in the past, we believe that study participants, we're asking them for a lot. We're asking them to donate information that's very sensitive in many cases. It's information about health. It can be information that could be stigmatizing in some cases. So we want to make sure that participants receive something from participating in research. So we really believe in reciprocity, and we've been iterating on this model of how to ensure reciprocity in projects that are distributed around the world in different geographies. And this is what, together with our ethics advisory board, that's what we've arrived to. So we have a benefit sharing program that consists of short-term and long-term benefits. So short-term, it's something that we want to ensure that the participating community, those are not individual benefits, those are community benefits, that the participating community gets something out of this participation immediately. So at the end of the study completion, there's a certain percentage of funds that are proportional to the size of the project that go back to the community, and it's up to them to decide how these funds are spent, but it's in order to support local capacity building, medical access, education, sustainable development. As a part of our short-term benefit sharing, for instance, we have supported the first Indigenous Genomics Conference organized by Singh in Aotearoa, New Zealand, But we also have something that I think is going to be much more impactful is our long-term sharing benefits, which is 4% of our revenue. We don't have any revenue yet, just to be completely clear about it. We are a startup, so completely VC funded, but hoping that one day we'll get there with the therapeutics that we develop. And then we want to make sure that we can, with that, thank the participants for participating in research. So 4% of our revenue, not profits. You can gain profits, you can't gain revenue, will go back to all the participating communities, whether we found something that led to a potentially novel therapeutic or not. That really doesn't matter. It's the participation that matters. And at the same time, if we ever get acquired or if we become a public company, there's 4% of the undiluted company equity that was set aside that can be then cashed out and at the same in the same manner distributed back to those communities to support very similar initiatives. And mostly I want to thank the people who have spent a lot of time helping us think through all those kind of how to do community engagement efficiently in a country that you know very little about, who to recruit there to help you, how to introduce this benefit sharing in a way that's equitable in different geographies, in different countries with different laws, and then how to think about data governance. And so this is our ethics advisory board, and thank you very much.
That was awesome. I guess I have a few questions for all of you. First, I'd like to just start and say, you know that I love talking about and thinking about the future. And I'm wondering what you think will happen in the future with benefit sharing programs. Do you think that many of the projects that you're working on are disruptive to the status quo? I guess we'll start with Anne, or yeah.
Yeah, so in the biodiversity space, it's a really exciting time because it's the first time a lot of these things are being brought up at the Convention of Biological Diversity when they're talking about the Nagoya Protocol. And this whole big topic is about how we are going to implement a benefit sharing system. And it's, you know, taking away from, so now in the Nagoya Protocol, it's all to do with bilateral sharing, and, you know, they're wanting to expand it to include digital sequence information. And they're wondering whether a multilateral system is more feasible for this. But if a multilateral system is put in place, we need to ensure that it's not only nations, like the parties to the Nagoya Protocol, that are being placed as part of the metadata, but also the indigenous peoples, if there are indigenous peoples that, you know, have contributed these samples, so that benefits are going directly to the indigenous peoples and not just to the nation states. So it's kind of interesting time in the biodiversity world, and a lot of action and talk about whether traditional knowledge in general is even digital sequence information. That is a topic under discussion also. So it's an exciting time.
Kaja, did you want to follow up?
Can you repeat the question, because I was looking for my charger?
Oh, all good, all good. I was just saying, benefit sharing seems to be disruptive to the status quo. Do you think that what you're doing is disruptive to the status quo? How's it going to change the future landscape? And, or how would you like to see it change it as well?
What I'd like to see is more companies doing what we're doing. As far as I know, we're the only biotech company that really has a model like that. And I think companies that interact with participants, except that get something out of the participants, and every company that does work in genomics is really relying on the data that is contributed by research participants, should be doing something similar. I don't know if our model is the best model. This is something we're testing and trying, and, you know, in a couple of years we can report in terms of how that's going. But that should be that should not be exception. That should be the rule, in my opinion.
Awesome. Krystal, want to add?
Sure, but Latifa, you raised your hand first.
Oh,
so do you want to go ahead?
Go ahead. Go ahead. I'm always here for your words of wisdom.
It is amazing that Indigenous ownership of Indigenous data is considered disruptive. To me, that's an obvious solution and choice, right? But one of the great things that I'm proud to be a part of is not just introducing this model of community ownership back to the people that generate the data, but also just trying to develop legal frameworks for ensuring that intellectual property is maintained by the tribes. And this is amazing how many loopholes there are in terms of research and federally funded research. Like, even though the NIH does recognize tribal sovereignty, how that actually plays out when there are these conflicting rules related to like federal-wide assurance policies, whether or not tribal research regulatory boards are even recognized as institutional review boards, whether or not large institutions, academic institutions even recognize the authority of tribes to review their own protocols. Like, there are a lot of loopholes in place. So having Indigenous scientists and advocates and researchers and leaders who are and lawyers who are working in concert to ensure that these frameworks are in place, that we have boilerplate language that the tribes can use and share among each other to ensure that legal protections are in place, I think is really stands to the credit of how much this work is needed, and I'm really glad to be a part of it.
Amazing. Latifa, did you want to add?
Oh yeah, you know, I appreciate what my colleagues have said, because when we look at things like Henrietta Lacks's cells that have been infinitely monetized, but no resources like those, there are members of her family who read at an 8th grade level and who have unsecured housing, unstable housing, right? And so then the question is, in a multi-billion-dollar industry, why should that be? Right? So, you know, the short answer to your question is, God, I hope so. I hope that we disrupt the entire system. I want, you know, equity, and that means, and I want opportunity. And so if we're participating in systems, it's because we see benefit for our communities, not personal benefit. Like, I'm not, I'm not saying that Henrietta Lacks herself his family should have like all the money, but I'm saying, imagine a system that exploited that resource and at the same time said, sorry, people who look like Henrietta Lacks can't come in the front door, can't learn how to do these, you know, advanced algorithms, can't participate at the highest levels, have, you know, a 10 times less likely chance of being funded for federal grants for which they're contributing tax dollars. Like, this is insane, folks. And if we don't dismantle this system, the system will eat itself, right? Because we will have made the system untenable for anybody else, right? Untenable to exist. So yes, let's please do that, you know, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have to be a constructive dismantlement of the system, because we, by our very presence, can build something much better than what one or two ethnicities and one gender can put together. You know, and then I'll just say that, like, this idea that there's a finite pie and that any slice that you give or that you commit to communities that are participating in the process takes away from somebody else is nonsense. You know, I'm just gonna, you know, because ultimately we're expanding the pie at every opportunity, new research projects, new ways of thinking of things, new ideas on how to monetize things, new communities to sell things to, right? With targeted, you know, resource sharing. So I hope, you know, that my children and our children will see something totally different and something better because of, you know, the willingness to, you know, to rebuild a system that doesn't work for all of us.
Well said. Yes, moving away from the kind of limited scarcity mindset to the abundance mindset, and moving in that direction. So we have benefit sharing programs. Let's say that given all the complexities, everything works out. what would you all like to see built in the sort of wake of that? In what ways would you like to see the impact happen? I guess I'll start with Krystal on this one.
Repeat the question, the first part of the question one more time, if you don't mind.
Oh yeah, first we talked about how it's disruptive to the status quo. Now we're talking about, let's go on the other side and say, all of this stuff works, right? We have one company that's trying it. Now let's say there's 1,000 companies where you can't you can't be a founder of a company unless it has benefit sharing policy. How does that transform the ecosystem of research? And what would you like to see?
Sure. As I mentioned in my talk, right now we have an issue where researchers are coming in and over-promising on things that they cannot deliver to communities, and with the promise that somewhere down the line this will translate to benefits for tribal members. And in the meantime, companies are profiting off of direct access to Indigenous data and DNA. And we need to ensure that some of that translates back to the community in a real-time fashion. That way, I mentioned that tribes can generate local data economies from themselves and actually start training next generation of Indigenous data science leaders so that they can be able to do this for themselves. Already, we're starting to talk about having more legally savvy tribal lawyers and legal tribal entities that know how to navigate these structures. But we're also talking about ensuring that research benefits come to communities as well to improve health outcomes for members. And this is really important as well, because this means that money can be funneled back into communities and for community members to direct research questions that interest them, as opposed to the research questions that interest companies. So right now we have a problem that companies are only interested in Indigenous DNA to study things that are marketable, that benefit the majority population. But there are also conditions that are specific to Indigenous peoples that we would also like to study. So if this is a means of ensuring there's capital generated to pursue those questions in a community-centered fashion, then we should go for it.
Awesome, totally agree. Anyone else want to chime in on that one? What would you like to see built? No?
Can I just say that I fully second this idea that Krystal has about education, because the goal is to train enough people from diverse communities, and particularly historically marginalized community, excluded communities, so that they don't need to just be consulted. They're the ones doing the work, right? And so what we need is a paradigm shift. But what we have to work towards in this interim period is, making sure that those individuals, that there's a sufficient cohort of individuals, and that those individuals feel empowered to both have a foot in the scientific world while being stably grounded in their communities, and that's really a global reality, because so much of the conversation, I really like Anne's comment about these multilateral versus, bilateral agreements, because that's the exact, that seems to me like underlying that exact problem. Like, how do we get at taking people from excluded status into included and sought after status?
Yeah, well said. I think we're at the top of the hour, so we're running out of time. We're going to need all of this moving forward to create a more equitable research environment, whether it's nonprofit organizations putting pressure on government institutions, projects that are really genuinely centered around community engagement, new technologies to trace provenance and create transparency and hold people responsible, and directly disruptive companies in the space of big pharma and many other things like this. So I just wanted to say mahalo nui to everyone who's joined us, to our incredible speakers. I don't think that it's a coincidence that you guys are women of power and you're directly making change in this field. So I just commend you, and I love working with each and every one of you. And thanks again. And I think we can stay on for kind of an after conversation if people are into that sort of thing. But thanks again, everybody.
I'm really glad that we found a good home to have this with the Academic Data Science Alliance, and just want to thank you all for working with us to, as a whole, through all the emails and logistics and planning, and also for the amazing talks. So thank you. You guys are all amazing.
Thank you for organizing. If it weren't for you, it would have never happened.
Very true.
Correct. Correct.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and bringing us along and making sure that, you know, you had a vision that, you know, that really spoke to us, because everybody's busy, but, you know, when it's important, you know, I think everybody was super excited to do this. So yay.
Yeah. And so glad we brought each other, like Keolu, thank you for bringing us all in together with each other so that we can learn from each other and get to really understand what we all do in concert. So thanks.
I'm personally hoping it's the first of many conversations around these ideas, and hopefully other organizations take this very seriously, because they'll basically be forced to, but it'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to see what happens. But yeah, I mean, I've been thinking a lot more about the back end of the benefit sharing, like what you build and how you transform things. And also, if there's a standard number in Patagonia or whatever gives away 1% of their royalties, how do we define what that number is, where we get into a position where it's still profitable for you to have a business, but also what's the maximum amount of money that you can give away? And this will be curious. I'm curious to see what people think. Can companies do more? I think they can.
Yeah, I think it's a super interesting question, and we were thinking about this a lot, because the company is kind of has responsibilities. If you're VC funded, you're responsible to your board, so they have to agree to that, right? So you have to convince them. If you're a public company, you're kind of responsible to your shareholders. And unless you're a B Corp, your responsibility is to maximize profit. So actually, the entire legal system, in a way, is set up that makes it extremely difficult for a company to do that. I can give you an overview of where we came with the 4% number, because we had no idea. There's no benchmarks, right? So what can we even compare ourselves to, right? So what we did is we thought, okay, so the information that we're collecting, we're going to a specific group. We have some indication that there's some higher frequency of disease. We collect genetic information, we collect medical information, we run analysis, and maybe there's an association. And then after validating this association, realize, oh, maybe this is relevant for therapeutics discovery. It can fail at many kind of points along that process, and maybe one day you kind of get to a drug. But when you're starting, absolutely, there's no guarantee, right? There is, and we don't even know what the probability is in the way we design these projects, because nobody's ever done it. So we started thinking about this, and compared it to what universities do around the world when they license out early IP. So this is kind of very relevant to the IP discussion, because, if a researcher when you're a researcher, and obviously all of you know that, if you work at a university, you assign all your inventions to that university, and the university can decide, I can license it out to somebody, and if it's early stage IP where somebody comes in, I love this license, but there's really no guaranteed path to profit from this. This is at an early stage. The usual kind of royalties that come to the university are, on average, when we did an analysis of American universities, was 3.5%. So we decided to kind of top it up to 4%, comparing it to this, just to be, hey, no, this is not a random number that appeared out of nowhere, to at least have some type of comparables. But I think how high you can go is kind of depending on the contribution. If you're going to somebody who's just I have a product, I know this is going to work, and you can basically market it tomorrow, then you can demand way more kind of a royalty down the line, because you're, in a sense, it's just like about how much risk there is. We have to put a lot of money, and then maybe there's something, maybe not, versus somebody de-risked it to a significant point. That's my perspective. So please feel free, to add anything.
No, I love it. And as you know, I'm writing about this right now, and it's very interesting thinking about and putting pressure on all of these different industries. In my opinion, no one should make more than $200,000 a year. And that's just my opinion. I just finished a book by probably the greatest sci-fi writer of our generation, just because Octavia Butler is passed away, and his name is Kim Stanley Robinson, and he really digs into a lot of those ideas in terms of like the futurist perspective. But I really appreciate that, Kaja. One of the things I was thinking about, Anne, is the way in which these provenance tracing technologies, this is fascinating to me. It's like I can connect Kona coffee to Kona, or Manuka honey to, or Guinness to England or Ireland. Oh God, forgive me. But there's also potential for it in terms of using it as an anti-counterfeit technology. Like I'm promising a company a product where we have transparency so that they know that the product they're getting is where it says it's from. But also it's connecting it to the community on the other side of the coin. And I'm wondering if those are transparent conversations you guys are having, or is that just like something you're Trojan horsing under the wall?
I've never heard somebody actually think about using the labels for that purpose. It's super interesting. Yeah, I've never heard it come from that angle. We've so many people jump it. It's actually super exciting because every time we present the labels, somebody presents a different way that they can be utilized. So like I come from the genomic space, so obviously attaching it to genomics information, but then you have the Smithsonian's coming on and saying, oh, well, we would like to attach them to artifacts, to songs, to, and just different ways people are thinking about it. So I love that idea. One thing I was thinking about from the benefit sharing perspective, and I wanted to hear your input as well, is that so in the research space, it's always split out into monetary and non-monetary benefit sharing. And it's also always this like black and white, and the non-monetary benefit sharing is always kind of thought of as the runners-up prize, when a lot of times that's all like the actual resources going into proper educational programs or other things like capacity building, technology transfer, huge things. And I was just wondering what your thoughts are there about maybe switching the names of how could we frame that better, that it's not the runners-up prize of non-monetary benefit sharing.
Yeah, I totally love that. And I think that like money is the intersubjective truth. Land, water, those types of resources. And one of the reasons I just love the concept is because it's literally like this potential linking mechanism to enable circular economic growth. And if that leads to our communities buying back our land, and I've talked with Kaja and many of you about this, and this is the exact same land that shaped our genomes in the first place, then so be it. Let's have that. But dollar bills, I don't really care for them that much.
I do caution using.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to caution against using education as a low-risk crumb to throw at us just in exchange for our data, because that's what happens. Like last summer, with the NIH had a couple of multi-consortia AI grants, Bridge2 AI and Aim Ahead, and all these entities wanted to work with our organization because they wanted access to Indigenous data. But they didn't want to give up agency or authority over research decisions. Nope, but they did want to throw at us, oh, we can fund your educational workshop. And that just felt like low risk for them, and yet like low risk and also high gain for them as well, because then they could just utilize our peoples as public relations, sticking an indigenous veneer on their work as well. So that feels extractive as well. I think Steve wants to kick us off too.
The veneer.
I 100% agree. And at Howard, we've been talking about, God, I don't want to be at Harvard right now.
Nobody does. Nobody does.
Well, they have some scandals, right? But, we've been really concerned about, what is the fate of the data scientists, the geneticists, genomicists that we're producing and sending out into the world, right? It's not enough for us to take careful care of trainees, develop their minds and their spirits, and then send them into known toxic environments, because we're not doing a service to our communities by doing that. Right. So we have to equally be careful. But I wanted to end on a kind of a funny story. Well, it's not really funny. Thomas Jefferson, when he took his, at that time, stepbrother to Paris, Sally Hemings's brother. Sally Hemings' brother was a trained chef, but he was African-American, so he was enslaved. And he developed macaroni and cheese. He learned from French chefs and he came back. And so we were joking about how macaroni and cheese is truly a Black enterprise and that everything else is just sparkling noodles. So I think that these are the kinds of things that we, as you think about monetizing, there is I hate to say branding because that is so callous, but there is a way to brand intellectual products as well as, commercial products in ways that help our community. And let's not hesitate to think about the helping of our community in not just the monetary sense, but also in the pride and, recognition sense, because they have been equally alienated from those.
That's amazing, the story about mac and cheese. Did he put the crumbs on top?
Yeah, and then as soon as he came home, Thomas Jefferson was like, hey, you guys, I created mac and cheese in Paris. And so he went around telling his colleagues. And so you can imagine that at Monticello, people were like, you didn't create mac and cheese, bro. You didn't do that. That wasn't you. You know what I mean? And so I'd like it to be known that, certain kinds of intellectual processes are coming from indigenous communities. Mm-hmm. They come and they're the natural byproduct of indigenous ways of thinking.
You gotta drop that on Twitter, the mac and cheese thing, because it's Blackish. Also, the dude who holds the IP for the sequencing synthesis that enabled Illumina's whole platform, he's Black. So learned that recently.
That part. Happy Black History Month, folks, in the US. Yeah. Or October in the UK, I hear. Okay. All right, I think that they're about to kick us off this platform, but I think our Twitter handles are out there, right?
Okay. Yes, they're out there, all the Twitter handles. We've hit the thing. Steve's kicking us off and out and into the cold. So
sorry.
No, it's all good.
No, it's okay. Yeah. Can you tell that we're colleagues and we also really enjoy each other?
That's wonderful.
Yeah,
we'll find a way to continue this conversation with the ADSA community too. This is really important and super interesting. So we look forward to more discussion.
Cool.
All right.
Thanks,
guys.
guys.
Everyone.
Bye.
See you guys soon.
Bye.
Take care. Aloha, everybody.